Now the place where we find this is if we go under Canvas and we go to Color Management Settings. Now you notice there is a keyboard shortcut here, which is Control, Alt, and K. And if I click on this, we'll get this dialog. And again, there's a whole lot of very technical stuff that you're going to see popping up here, and a lot of it is going to be very confusing if you've never dealt with these topics before. You'll notice up here that we also have the ability to create presets, but currently there's only one preset, which is default. So what we want to do here is we want to think about what it is that we're trying to do with Painter. If you're working with the idea that your artwork is going to be ultimately seen on a screen, whether it be a monitor or a HD TV or any other type of screen, then you're probably going to want to stick with this default RGB profile of sRGB. Now you'll notice at the end here that there's this NOBPC. What that's saying is this has no black point compensation. And generally speaking, black point compensation is something that you do want. So what I would do instead is I would go ahead and click this down arrow, and I would select the next sRGB down, which is with black point compensation. And then I would also go over here and I would look at our default CMYK conversion profile. And in this particular instance, we're not going to worry too much about what's going on with the CMYK, because our output is going to be meant to go on to the internet or into a movie production or a TV commercial or whatever it is that you might be doing with Coreal Painter. So in this instance, the only thing that really matters here is the RGB, because we're only ever going to be working in RGB, so we can pretty much ignore the CMYK conversion process. Now, in addition to that, we can look here at the color profile policies. Now, generally speaking, we want to use the embedded profile. The other choices are use the default profile, but generally speaking, unless you know what it is that you're doing, you're going to want to use the embedded profile. Now, if there's a profile mismatch, you can ask when opening. I find this to be a really good policy. That way, if something comes in and it's a strange profile and you want to convert it to your sRGB with black point compensation, then you'll get good results. Now, below that, you'll see that we have the color engine is Windows CMS. Now, this will be different if you're on a Macintosh operating system. And the rendering intent here is by default set perceptual. I don't find perceptual to be the best option for paintings, and that's primarily what I do. So instead, I would use relative color metric. And that would be my recommended settings if you're working for the web. So what I'll do now is I'll just come over here and click this little plus sign, and we're going to add a new preset. And this one we're just going to call web and say save. If we're doing any kind of work that's destined for print, we're going to change a lot of these settings. The first setting that we're going to change is the RGB profile, because sRGB is really great for working on the web and working on multiple different monitors, because pretty much every monitor in the world is designed to work with sRGB as a minimum. It's sort of like the baseline minimum standard profile for RGB. The problem with it is it's also really small because it has to work on so many different devices. It doesn't really have a big range of colors that are available to it. And this can become a real bad problem when it comes time to convert to CMYK. So what we want instead is we want to choose a color profile that has a lot more space to it. And the one that I recommend usually is Adobe RGB 1998. And generally speaking, that's sort of the industry standard for any kind of print work. Now, the default CMYK conversion profile is going to become sort of a little bit more dependent upon what it is that you're actually doing. Generally speaking, you're going to get your marching orders from whoever you're working with, whether it be a printer or a publisher or an editor. They're going to tell you what CMYK that you're going to be using. However, if you don't know and you're just kind of want to go for a generally default safe CMYK profile, I would choose the US Sheetfed Coded version 2. I find that that's a lot more standard than this web coded. And the main reason why is because this swap, as it's called, standard web offset press, is meant for really large print runs. We're talking over 100,000 copies. To start up a web press, you start it up and you shut it down within 30 seconds, and you've already printed a couple thousand printouts. It's not meant for short print run stuff, and most stuff these days is printed on a sheet fed press. So I recommend the sheet fed press more often than not as just a good baseline default. But like I said, you'll be told exactly what profile you should be using by either your printer, your publisher, or your editor. And if they don't know, then you've got some serious problems because you just don't know what's going to come out when you're printing. Now, the next thing that we want to look at here is keeping all of these settings exactly the way they were set before, including the relative colorimetric. We're going to click the plus sign to add a new profile, and we're going to call this one print. And now, whenever you're wanting to switch your workflow from web to print, you'll have both these default profiles in there. I'm going to leave it on print most of the time because that's, generally speaking, how I tend to work. I'm going to hit OK, and that's going to be our new color space profile. So now what I want to do here is, I started this in sRGB, if you remember, because that was the default profile that we were using at the time. So now I'm going to go up here to Canvas, and I'm going to convert to profile. And you can see here that the existing profile is sRGB with no black point compensation. And we want the new profile to be Adobe RGB 1998. And we want the color engine to be Windows CMS. Now, of course, like I said, you could also be using something different on the Macintosh operating system. And the rendering intent, they set it here for perceptual. Again, I would change this to relative colorimetric. And flatten image. This is if you have any kind of layers. We don't have layers, and we're not into layers yet, so I'm just going to go ahead and leave that checked. And I'm going to hit OK. Now, you shouldn't notice any kind of really big changes in the colors because we just switched from one RGB profile to another, and we switched from a smaller RGB profile, which is sRGB, to a larger RGB profile, which is Adobe RGB 1998, meaning that we've not really reduced the amount of colors because we're going from smaller to larger triangles. But now what we want to do is we want to proof this to see what it's going to look like when we print out in our CMYK. So in order to do that, we're going to come up to Canvas, and we're going to go to color proofing mode. Now, before we go to color proofing mode, we're going to set our color proofing settings. And we're going to do that in the next video.